Welcome back to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, the Executive Director of Denison Forum. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Today we are talking with Aaron Pierce, who is a member of the ministry organization Steiger International. Aaron, thank you for joining us today.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Aaron is based in Minneapolis, but is a native of Europe, correct? Where are you from originally?
I was born and raised in Amsterdam. Which is where the mission that I lead today was founded by my parents.
Okay, fantastic. I can't claim, I have a rule when it comes to traveling that I can't claim that I've ever been somewhere unless I got out of the airport.
I know where you're going. Yeah, that doesn't count. The airport does not count.
So I can claim that much that, on my way to Germany, there was a few hours of layover in Amsterdam, but that doesn't qualify. So it's still on my bucket list at this point.
All right. You got to do it. It's an amazing city.
So tell us about a little bit more about Steiger International to kind of give us a context of how old the ministry is, what the focus and mission, passion, vision of Steiger is all about, and maybe some of the genesis of where it came from.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so Steiger is kind of a weird word, obviously, and it's because it's a Dutch word. My parents were missionaries in Amsterdam. They're Americans, but they're missionaries in Amsterdam, and they had a heart to reach the young people of the city that would not walk into a church, which in a city like Amsterdam is essentially all young people. And they see these big, beautiful cathedrals and they're dead and empty on Sunday. And that's their view of God, right? Just an irrelevant tradition of the past, not really having any connection to my life. And that was the group of people that they had a burden to reach. And so my dad would take a small group of people into the bars and nightclubs late at night and connect with people and build relationships and share Jesus. And then they would write down the names of everyone they met and go out into the forest and pray all night and just ask God for a breakthrough in the city. And so doing that for a little while, after a few years, my dad, who was really beginning to engage and connect into the music scene of the city, really felt led to start a musical band as a tool to communicate Jesus from the stage in secular places, essentially lifting up the message of the cross outside the church. And so he did this, and suddenly things just began to open up, and they started to see many, many people come to Jesus. And then the challenge is like, what do you do with all of them, right? And so they had a Bible study on a big red boat behind the central train station. Now, if you had gotten out of the airport, you would have gone to the central train station because it's right in the middle of the city, and there's a river that runs behind it, and there's all these piers that jet out. And so the Dutch word for pier is Steiger. And so they named their Bible study, which became a church, they named it the address, which was Pier 14 or Steiger 14 in Dutch. And that was the genesis of this missions movement that evolved. Because what happened is then this band that my dad started to go to other places. They went to communist Poland and the Soviet Union, and people were reached in secular environments. Christians were inspired, and people began to identify with this movement called Steiger that was, again, referring to this church on a boat in Amsterdam. And so that was kind of the genesis, the move of God. And then it evolved into a true mission organization, which eventually, through my own story, I end up taking leadership of. And now our whole heart is we reach what we call the global youth culture, young adults all over the planet, influenced by similar voices, buying into secular ideology and a lifestyle that reflects that and far from God. And so our heart is to mobilize followers of Jesus to reach young people who would not walk into a church all over the world.
Wow. Love that. Wow. What a great passion and vision. So urgently needed, and love the idea of trying to connect with a culture of people through music, right? What could be a better way, right? You talk about music being the international language, right? And everybody loves music. Everybody has a great appreciation, especially for music that is well done, right?
Right.
And so it just, you see that in so many different ways. All the music programs that you see around the world, that draw people in just because people have that love, right?
Yep.
And
Yeah, and it has the ability. Art is that's part of. I think it speaks to the way we're designed. We're like the God's the creator, right? And
yeah,
art has that ability to communicate truth in a way that connects and also gets around our walls. And so it's just a beautiful way of communicating the gospel message in secular environments. So long as but it's like being a good missionary, right? It's like doing it in a language that people understand. And so using the arts and music is a big part of what we do because of how effective it is at communicating the truth.
right. So you've now taken over the leadership from your parents, is that right?
Yeah, they're still very much active.
Yeah.
So my parents, I call my dad like a Braveheart leader because he charges the front lines, but he doesn't sit back and organize the troops and
Yeah.
people are inspired by that. And so what's cool is he's continued to be that. He's a catalyst, a pioneer, an evangelist, but I've been able to come back and like build a mission out of that. And it's been a pretty fun thing to do with your dad and to see the fruit of this thing taking hold. We're active in over 100 cities around the world now. And God's just been very good and faithful. And we've been able to see people all over the world raised up to go after young people that won't walk into a church.
Yeah. So if I'm hearing you right, this may or may not make that much of a difference in the way y'all think about yourselves, but the ministry is several decades old
Right.
at this point, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's evolved, right? So but yes, it's more than several decades. It started in the 80s. So
Okay.
I don't even know how long that
40 years or so, 35, 40 years, something like that.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. You're talking to a guy who graduated high school in 1985 or 1981. So,
Right.
yeah, you're talking to an old guy like that. But, so part of the way we became aware of Steiger is one of the folks in our ministry, Craig Denison, has some connections to Steiger, and said not only did he think y'all were doing great work and had become impressed with the way y'all were trying to reach younger people who were far from God, but particularly how the world has been trained now onto the area of Ukraine.
Right.
And to, as you talked about earlier, the Russian-speaking population that is in that part of the world, which y'all are very acquainted with. But we were trying to find ways to discover as many partners as we could who were doing good work in the midst of the crisis of the war between Russia and Ukraine, who understood what was going on, who might be able to facilitate our audience, believers individually or churches individually, how they might be able to engage, how they could pray, how they might be able to support materially, how even if you couldn't go to Ukraine because of the war, you might go to one of the surrounding countries.
Yep.
I've had pastor friends that have relationships like that in places like Romania and Poland.
Yep.
As I'm sure you'll help us understand, this is not a situation that is simply isolated to Ukraine or to a certain part of Russia. That
Yep.
this is really affecting and destabilizing a much wider area as well. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how y'all are experiencing things, what you're seeing kind of narrowly within the environment of Ukraine, and what are some things going on there that you think that would be helpful for believers in America and churches in America to understand how they might help, and then out into that somewhat wider audience that the whole European theater really being affected. And like I said, I have a sense that your ministry really has a passion for the Russian-speaking world, has a
Yep.
passion for the whole world, but particularly
Right.
in some ways for
Yep.
work within the Russian-speaking world. So kind of unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's been an incredible 3 months, and it's so no one saw this coming, right? Like even all of our Ukrainian. So we have a very strong team. We have about 70 people in multiple cities throughout Ukraine, and then we also have people in Russia and Belarus and all around. We have a very strong presence in Poland as well. And none of us thought this was going to happen, and it was
Yeah, a lot of up until just a few months ago, it may be the start of the year. I'm not sure many Americans could have even told you where Ukraine was. One of the things I've learned in the recent months is that hey, when you start thinking about Ukraine, you're thinking about a territory the size of Texas,
Right.
basically.
Right.
So this is not some little postage stamp that's in the middle of this story. And now we have this iconic figure that has emerged
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
this amazing story, right?
Right. Right.
Kind of a David and Goliath story that's starting to show up, and so yeah, there's just so many things we want to learn and that we're already being inspired by.
Yeah. And I think that one of the crazy things is like the Ukrainians, while they were like beginning to want to identify with the West and get connected into Europe and find their independence, there was still a deep bond with Ukrainians and Russians. Like
Yeah,
there was a deep relational bond. And so that's what's so crazy about this. And where Putin's so drastically miscalculated because he thought he was coming in and he was going to have flowers and a reception and people, they wanted their independence, but there's deep relationships. And a lot of that has been shocking for our people because we have a strong presence throughout the Russian speaking world. We have these Telegram groups with hundreds and hundreds of people from all across the region, and they're just shocked at what has happened. So from a kind of political relational perspective, it was like, where did this come from? Because there are still deep relational connections there. But then the whole, you can read the news, just the devastation and the destruction of these cities and the atrocities that have been occurred. It's been overwhelming, and of course that's created all sorts of tension without our own mission, right? We got people that are trying to navigate this, and it's created all sorts of issues. But despite all of the awful things that have taken place, as is always the case, God has begun to emerge, like the light of the gospel has begun to emerge in really powerful ways. So what was really cool is like we have a really dynamic network of young missionaries, and we're very kind of young, grassrootsy, and with a strong network throughout the country of Ukraine. And so these are guys that, their day job they're missionaries, they're evangelists, they're disciplers, they're engaging this global youth culture. But then when this crisis hit, I was so impressed because they're just sincerely following the Lord, and they just pivoted and responded in a way that you just can't manufacture it because it was just so authentic and so in tune with what God was doing. And so they began to just respond and take all of their network, all of their connections, and just pivot to humanitarian needs, bringing food, bringing, supplies, bringing people, driving into active conflict zones and getting people out, and just brave people who are not running from this, they're going into it. And so it was just, and that's what Christians have done, right? Throughout Christian history, there's the ones that have gone into the fire because we know that this world is not all we have. This is not our only hope. And so I've just been so impressed with these guys because they have shown that their faith was genuine because it's tested in these moments, right? So they've really stepped up. And then on top of that, we have a dynamic team in Poland, and so they just got to work too, and it was really cool and really encouraging.
Yeah, sounds like a great expression of living the faith from a standpoint of meeting material needs, meeting real needs, in order to have additional opportunity and credibility to talk to people about their spiritual needs, right?
No doubt.
But it is completely the living out of what James warns us about, where you say, oh, well, if that's your problem, good luck with that. Be warm, be filled. I'm not going to get involved. This was exactly the opposite of that. As the church, being active as a church, even in, like you said, these extreme ways, going into combat zones to try to get people, families out, right? And again, like I said, we've heard these crazy stories, right, where a son living in a Ukrainian city is calling his dad in Russia going, Dad, why is your army bombing us, right? And his dad going, oh, we're not doing that. Yeah. He's like, well, look out the window here. Let me show you on my iPhone what's going on.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So in that regard, Aaron, have y'all lost anybody on your team, particularly in the combat zones?
No. not yet, by God's
Oh,
grace.
thank goodness. Yeah.
We had
Awesome.
one of our team members that felt led and joined the armed forces. So we
Oh,
don't know
wow.
about him.
Yeah.
But other than that, they've all have engaged on the humanitarian side, and by God's grace, they're all still doing okay today.
Right.
But they are actively going into the east, into the Donbass region. They're bringing supplies. They're taking people out.
Right.
It's crazy, but they're, like you said, they're also meeting the spiritual needs, because those needs are still great. Like right at the beginning, we have a very strong team in Kiev. And we have this large house that's a community house. It's basically kind of this relational bridge between secular culture and the church. And it's very
Yeah.
cool, very dynamic. They run like Bible studies for the non-religious there. And so they have a really strong team. And most of our team left and they went out into the country. They didn't leave the country, the actual country, but they went out of the city.
Right.
But a couple of our leaders felt compelled. And remember, at the beginning, we didn't know how this war was going to go. Like no one saw that they were going to be able to repel the forces from Kiev. So they stayed in Kiev and they opened up their basement and brought people in,
Wow.
especially a lot of people that they were ministering to and met their physical needs. But then it was powerful times of prayer and studying the word. They saw people baptized in their basement while bombs are dropping above them. And just like incredible things that God was doing. And then they would go out into like the subway stations and they would bring physical needs and pray with people and give Bibles. And God people's hearts were open to that, right? Because it's the gospel in action and words. But man, it just, people's hearts were so open, and we saw pretty incredible transformation and fruit as a result.
Yeah, what kind of amazing, intense ministry, right? Hey, none of us knows if we're going to make it to the next day, right?
Yeah.
We don't know if there'll be, a soldier coming down the stairway here in a few minutes that's from the opposing army. We don't know if the next bomb is going to, land at a place that's going to end our lives, and man, it becomes intense and very focused at that point, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it takes truths that are always present and it brings it like right in your face, because we are always fully dependent on God. Our next day is never promised. There's always an urgency for the gospel, but in those moments it like crystallizes.
Yeah.
And so it's cool because what those moments reveal is like, where have you put your hope? Is this, and I was just so proud of these guys because it just, they responded. Everything that they knew was just obliterated, but their faith in Jesus, the connection to him no war can take that away. And so it was just cool to see their response. And I think that's a challenge for us, right? Like where do we put our hope? Where is our, core? And so I don't know, it's been an encouraging thing.
Well, that's what's so inspiring to us, right? And it becomes a manifestation of that deal of, you're going to find out that Jesus is all you need when Jesus is all you've got, right?
That's it. Exactly.
Yeah. And when you're hiding in a basement or a subway station because there's an invading army, you don't have much. You don't have much of anything, and hopefully you understand and recognize your need for Jesus and for what is eternal. And if you don't have it, you turn to it, because that's just where it finally comes down to the bottom line at that point.
Yeah, and kind of the illusion that I'm in control, or that illusion just disappears in that context. Because that's true of us, right? That's true of us in Dallas and Minneapolis. That is true, but we can get distracted by kind of temporal, material things around us.
Yeah, and something like a war certainly pushes all of that distraction out of the way in every way. So now that the war has progressed in the way that it has, I'm assuming that some of your ministry, particularly within the eastern part of Ukraine, is kind of somewhat falling into a pattern of, okay, well, this is, it's not completely chaotic and different every day.
Right.
But it's kind of starting to fall into some kind of a groove. Is that probably the case?
Yeah, it kind of, you go through these, first it's just crisis, right?
Yeah.
Like crisis, and then you start to find some rhythms, and the circumstances are changing. But we are seeing some stability now to some degree in the West. and the situation, it looks like we might get into a bogged down thing for a while. So in that sense, there's some predictability right now in which you can work with. And so we're continuing to engage in our kind of gospel fueled humanitarian work, but we're also bringing back some of our other, just the normal work that we're doing, engaging secular culture. And then the other thing is like, there's a whole new ministry in the diaspora where we've got Ukrainians all over the world now. Right.
Yeah. So I was going to say a big part of what's probably going on in places like Poland and surrounding nations is just the ongoing management of this massive refugee reality. Right.
Yeah. And as is the case with any situation like that, and that's so much what happened with the early church, is you get this disbursement, right? And it creates an opportunity both on the receiving side, but it also, there was especially in our mission, but not just, there were some dynamic, on fire followers of Jesus in Ukraine that are now being dispersed to the world. And I believe that God's going to use that, right? Yeah. So God takes these awful things and these moments of crisis, and he does things that we couldn't even see coming. And I believe that's the case.
Yeah, kind of starts resembling some of the stories that we see in the book of Acts, right? Of, hey, these believers were like, hey, we don't know if we're supposed to leave, but it seems that God is telling us, hey, don't stand here and get yourself jailed or even killed because of this group or that group of Romans or hostile Jews, and all of a sudden the circumstances basically result in Christians getting scattered everywhere, which ends up they just decide once they get scattered that they'll be missionaries.
Right. That's what's happening now. So it's an incredible thing because we're seeing some of our really passionate Ukrainian missionaries spreading out throughout Europe. And remember, Northern Europe is dead when it comes to Christianity. And so they're bringing life and passion. And so I just believe that God's in it. We're even seeing some of them come to like cities like New York or Sacramento on the West. And I just think God's going to take some of the fire that he's put in the Ukrainian people and he's going to spread it to other places. So I think God's up to something with this.
Yeah, well, we hope so. We're kind of seeing that inspirational fire on the political side, right, coming through President Zelensky. But what we're talking about on the spiritual side is what's really eternal and even lasting, right? Is hopefully there'll be stories soon to come out of this American community or this American city, this American church that really was inspired and ignited in a whole new way for the gospel because, this Ukrainian came and said, look, I was all in for the gospel, whether I lived or died. And are you living that way? Are you living focused and simple? Have you kind of pushed the distractions away? Because what's really eternal is what is spiritual and what is of Christ, right?
That's it. And it's just like it would be something that God would do, right? To take the least influential, the weak, the ones that don't have all. I mean, they don't even have a country in a sense, right? They've been refuge, and God would use those people to inspire and bring change. And so I'm excited to see what God does with that.
Yeah. So Aaron, is it too early right now to tell how the courageous faith of these believers, particularly in Ukraine, is it too early to tell how that's going to create fruitfulness when this conflict is over? In along the lines of, hey, when there was nobody else here to help me, nobody else here to talk to me about, what real hope looks like, you guys were here, you stayed, some of you stayed, you took us in, you brought us supplies. If it hadn't have been for you caring for us out of the compassion of the gospel, we would have had no hope. We would have had no provision. It sounds like it may be a little bit too early to tell what the ongoing fruitfulness of that ministry may become.
Yeah, and there's been immediate fruit, in terms of like salvation and people making commitments to follow Jesus. That's already there. And I think there's a sense of, we don't meet those tangible physical needs with a condition, right? Like it's
Yeah.
not like we
Right.
give
Yeah.
that freely and
Yep.
trust that the fruit of that God will do things. But what also is true of any crisis is there's an opportunity.
Yep.
In fact, our work in the Russian-speaking world really blew up, grew fast in 2014 after the first, crisis that occurred, and we saw it just grow. And there are opportunities, but they're windows that don't stay open forever.
Hmm.
Right. So even a very relevant example, 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an opportunity for the gospel to go forth right then. And there was some great things, but there was also some kind of passive, like this window will be open forever. And it wasn't, both in terms of people's hearts, but also the political nature that will inevitably change. And certainly today, like Russia is in a really tough place in terms of the gospel. Right. The churches are under so much control and repression and it's been building up. We've been working in Russia for a while. There was a law that passed, I think around 2016, that made it illegal to publicly evangelize unless you were registered with the government. So the control has been building over time. So you have windows of opportunity that are not going to stay open forever, and you need to respond. And so I believe that whether it's in Ukraine, we have a window. And we need to really, respond because you don't know what the future holds. And so, I think that's how we need to see this.
Yeah. So, tangibly speaking, what are some ways that you would say that Christians that will hear this podcast, churches that may be exposed to this podcast, what can they do? How should they pray? How should they partner? How can they get involved in some of what God is doing in Ukraine? Can they receive people that have exited the country? Can they support churches and people in places like Poland and surrounding countries? How would you advise Christians, pastors, churches to really focus for this window that is there right now?
Yeah, I think that now is the window of opportunity for the gospel. And the reason I say it is that, the big boys with humanitarian, the secular humanitarian guys, they're in there now. But they don't have that we have is the gospel. So we need to be really the church needs to be, I think, intentionally fueling gospel work. It can be, humanitarian as well. But that's where I think the church needs to be focused now. Because like I said, there's billions of dollars in aid being brought into Ukraine by the big secular, and that's great. Yeah. But what we have and what the world needs and what Ukraine needs is Jesus. And so I would say focus yourself on those organizations you're connected to. And we're one of them, but we're not the only one that is gospel centered in our approach. Because that is the ultimate answer. And that's what the church should be supporting uniquely. That's our focus. So I would say focus on the organizations that are not just bringing the aid, they're bringing the gospel. And then, of course, then give. Steiger, you can give through Steiger. It's steiger.org/Ukraine relief. That's the way you can give to us. And all of that goes 100% to the work of, again, gospel-fueled humanitarian work in Ukraine. But then there are other ways. Ukrainians are coming to our country and you can welcome them in. There's a lot of great ministries that do great refugee work, but I would say that many of these Ukrainians are assets to our communities and to the church and draw them in and welcome them in, not just as kind of poor victims, but man, we need your fire in our church, in our cities. And so see them as assets that God has brought to your city. And then, there are ways that you can personally be involved. We have a very, very dynamic team throughout Poland. And we help facilitate volunteers that want to get involved in, and the volunteers are doing work on the Poland side, but they're also going into the Ukraine side. So if you're interested in that, you can email us, usa@steiger.org.
So does that mean that there are some opportunities where people who might want to go and, I know somebody that went to Poland last month and spent some number of days, right, being engaged with a church that's in that work and in that area, and actually helping them with the ministry that they have created for this window, for this situation. So People can connect to you. They can find out about those opportunities. If they actually want to go, there are ways that they can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's connections where they can work with us, but we're also very networked with churches and other ministries, and we're all talking to each other like where the needs are. So if that is an opportunity, certainly, and the simplest way to do that is just to email us at usa@steiger.org, and then we make the appropriate connections.
Right. Okay. Talk a little bit more about if you want to, Steiger, or your work internationally, but particularly how you're now sensing that that America, the United States, maybe Northern Europe as well, Western Europe. Mm-hmm. We are talking through Denison Forum right now just about the fact that we're seeing this rising secular ideology, religion in our country that is a rising tide of opposition, but also an opportunity for the gospel, as you said, that right now you can make a very strong case for America being in a very spiritually dark place.
That's right.
And we may not have the ornate cathedrals of Europe, but we do have a lot of empty church buildings.
That's right.
And certainly things like sexual abuse scandals in the church, whether you want to talk about that in a Roman Catholic sense or you want to talk about that in a Protestant sense. This week, particularly in the context of Southern Baptist, which is the root out of which I come, that's hurt our witness and damaged our credibility in a lot of ways. Yep. But particularly through the ministry that y'all are passionate about to younger people, how are y'all starting to now see, focus, and engage ministry within the West, within the United States and Western Europe, to try to engage the younger culture and to really start addressing their struggles, their questions, sometimes, as you said earlier, their hostility to the gospel? How are y'all starting to work with that?
Yeah, great question. Well, again, if you had talked to us about 5 years ago and asked what we're doing in the U.S., we'd have said nothing, because the needs, are so much greater overseas. And certainly the unreached people groups of the world is still an incredible need that we need to be focused on. But what we found as what's happened is we've gone through a profound cultural shift. So we've gone from a nominal Christian nation, which most identified as a Christian and most had a positive view of the church, and they saw the Bible as a moral guide or authority. That was the context, right? And that was the context that Billy Graham could fill stadiums. Right. And it really resonated with the times that he was in. Well, what's happened, fast forward 30, 40 years later, and particularly amongst the millennial and Gen Z generations, you've seen a drastic shift where the fastest growing religious group in our country is the religiously unaffiliated.
Right.
And it's not just affiliation, it's attitude. So increasingly the attitude has gone from positive to apathetic at best, hostile at worst. And so the challenge is the way in which we engage people has to reflect a change in culture. And so the biggest paradigm is we can't wait for them to come to us. We got to go to them. And unfortunately, most of our models for evangelism are based on the previous context. So it's kind of a bring your friend, come and see. It's why Easter and Christmas is still really a big deal, which it is for a certain group of people. But there's an increasing percentage of people that will never walk into a church and have all sorts of negative, often misconceptions of what it means to follow Jesus. And so the paradigm is we've got to mobilize the church to go to them. Right. And go to their context, to develop authentic relationships with people who are far from God, to engage in spiritual conversations that get to the assumptions. The challenge is this. If I go to someone today, an average 25-year-old secular person, and I say, hey, if you were to die today and stand before God in heaven and he were to judge your life, would he let you in? Well, I've just presupposed a whole bunch of things that they probably don't hold to be true. Or if I approach them with the 4 spiritual laws, all of which is good and true, it's based on assumptions that many secular young people just don't hold to be true. Right. So the challenge is we've got to go where they are, build authentic relationships in their context, and then begin to have these spiritual conversations, which are distinct from gospel conversations, that build the foundations for the cross. And the opportunity is this: while we are seeing this drastic cultural shift, people are very much open to spirituality and very much open to these things. So, and they're hungry for truth, because right now the religion of the culture is secular humanism, which is basically the religion of self.
Right.
I define truth. I define my meaning. I define what my feelings are, my reality. And it's a very confusing and broken place in reality. And so people are searching for truth. They're searching for hope. They're just not walking into the church. So we got to go to that. So that's our heart here in the U.S.
Right. Well, yeah, and that completely resonates with what we're about at Denison Forum. We have a book that we're currently promoting that Dr. Denison wrote. You may have heard of it, called The Coming Tsunami, that talks exactly about that, right? And how do we get to those assumptions, and how do we build around a conversation that all people are spiritual in nature? They're not simply physical, emotional, mental, but they are also spiritual, and intuitively, most people will agree with that.
That's right.
Like you said, and not be afraid to have those kinds of spiritual conversations, which can work through those assumptions and then move toward, okay, well, let's talk about what the depth, the dynamic, the definition, and the dynamics of what we can know about spirituality, rather than just simply a nebulous kind of gray, undefined spirituality, or that could take a lot of other very strange forms, if you will. Let's talk about the credible story, the big story of the gospel and of what Christianity presents. Right.
That's right.
I try to tell people, when you're trying to think about God's big story, and you're trying to think about, where would I have this conversation? What part of this conversation would I have with somebody who basically did not share any of your assumptions, right? Well, if you can get through some of those foundational spiritual conversations about human beings being spiritual beings, then you can start talking about God's big story that's revealed in Christianity, whether, starting with creation, the catastrophe of sin, the covenant relationship that he created with Israel for revelation, the whole story of Christ and what the cross is all about, where the church comes into existence, why it exists, and then the promise of the coming kingdom. You can kind of frame the whole story of what Christianity is about around those 6 or 7 words.
That's right.
But like you said, you got to get past the hostility in some ways. And one of the things we're really trying to help Christians understand and work with right now is we have moved culturally in the West to a place of not just indifference, but to real hostility and fear. There are many who are saying to us that not just Christianity, but all religion is evil, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that if we could just get rid of religion in a very broad definition, we would all be better off. But the problem with that is that we are by very nature spiritual religious people. We're going to worship something.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly right. And how most people, it's why so many young people are drawn to like Eastern religious ideas. Yeah. The reason is because it's spirituality without accountability, right? Like, I can have my cake and eat it too. Yeah. And it's because deep inside, we do sense there's more than meets the eye. Now you're gonna meet your like hard stone atheist, and there's a way to engage him. But most people are in this kind of have this pick and choose spirituality because they recognize that there's something transcendent. There's something more. You can't quantify beauty. You can't quantify love, like sacrifice. These are things that aren't. You can't. There's no test tube for that. Right. And people recognize that, and there's this innate desire for something beyond. And that is a point that you can connect on. There's also, I mean, there's so many ways. And that's one of our key things. We have a number of key resources. One's called Jesus in the Secular World, which is kind of helping people understand the context and respond with a broken heart. And then the other is Spiritual Conversations for the Non-Religious. And part of that is recognizing that, in a sense, everything is spiritual. And to attune your mind to how you can take what seemingly seems like a secular conversation and begin to prod and engage through questions, a spiritual conversation, even like, and this can be people whose view of the world is opposite of you.
Right.
So where I find this the greatest opportunity is in people's political and social justice views, and that gets very hostile, very divisive. But what you recognize, if someone is politically active, right? If they're fighting for a particular cause, what does it say about them? It says that they believe the world is not as it ought to be. And as a follower of Jesus, we can agree with that. And not only that, they're willing to do something about it. They're fighting. They want to make a difference. They want to live for something beyond themselves because God has put them inside them. Right? We were created for good works in advance, whether we know Jesus. So these are all things that we can connect on. But then you can also challenge where their views are out of line with gospel truth, right? So the secular worldview says that with enough education and the right laws and with enough time, we can fix ourselves. And that is not the Christian worldview, right? Because the ultimate problem is sin in my heart. And so we can talk to someone and say, I admire your desire to make the world a better place. And I admire your activism. But the problem is it doesn't seem to matter how many laws or whatever political system we put in place, it doesn't get rid of the corruption of the heart, right? And we can begin to build a block that on which we can present the message of the cross.
Right. Yeah. Well, great explanation. So, in terms of y'all's approach at this point to the West, to America, are y'all trying to develop ministry strategically into like population centers, or what's your approach?
Yeah, our focus is on cities, which is our global focus. We focus on establishing what we call city teams. And the primary objective is, one, we want to train and serve the local church to reach the secular culture of their community. Right. And everywhere I go, talking to pastors, they all feel this problem. They just don't know what to do about it. Yep. And then within the congregation, we're not talking about trends and statistics. We're talking about sons and daughters, right? Yep. This is probably the most prayed for thing in the church today is young adult kids that have walked away from the church. And so our heart is, how can we serve the church by equipping them, training the church to engage their Jerusalem, right? Their community. And so we have a bunch of resources and training and ongoing partnerships that's designed for that. And then the other key objective is we want to raise up young leaders that are going to lead the church, the Big C Church of America, to engage this post-Christian culture that we live in, and to be the ones that are going to bring them the new models and the ways of engaging this culture. And then what we do is we take these young leaders and our church partnerships, and we establish long-term teams in cities. And they're I love the idea of a catalyst, because it's relative to the size of a city, it's a small group, right?
Right.
But all in, they're passionate, and they're experts at engaging the secular culture. They're going to secular places. They're building relationships. They're sharing the gospel. They're building discipleship relationships that become multipliers. But then they take that experience, they take that authority, and they go serve the church of their city by resourcing them and training them and giving them opportunities to engage in evangelism, so that a small team can catalyze the church of a city. And that's the vision that we have. And we're currently active. We've built teams in 4 cities, and we've got a bunch in the pipeline.
Okay. What cities are you in currently?
So we're in Minneapolis, Denver, Houston, and just launching in Sacramento. And then we got a bunch of cities in the pipeline. Dallas is on that list. So, and it's all about relationship and partnership with churches and ministries.
Yeah. And people can connect to that through your website. They can explore that and look for ways to get connected with you.
Yeah. So again, if you're a church leader, you can go, there's a whole section on, bring Steiger to your church. If you're a young person, you're like, man, I want to do this. There's our whole mobilization and training program. If you just want to learn more about our resources, it's all on our website at steiger.org.
Yeah. Well, that's great. It's just, like you said, the mission field for many believers, many pastors, many parents. Sometimes it's just right across the hallway or up the stairs, to your own teenager or young adult, right?
That's right.
And
Exactly right.
and that's certainly going on. And how do we equip believers? How do we equip parents as well as pastors? How do you go and have that conversation? How do you go find the secular community within your city, right? Because it's so easy for Christians to just get so wrapped up in their own huddle of people, their own fellowship. Everybody feels like they only have very limited amount of time. And so, well, I didn't intend to put myself in an echo chamber, but that's what I did.
That's it.
And I don't even know where the secular community of my town lives. What places do they go?
Yep.
And what are they doing for entertainment or anything, right?
Yeah, no, exactly right. I mean, you're talking about cross-cultural missions in your own city.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's within your own city. And the reason you're going to sacrifice your time and reprioritize your life is because God breaks your heart. Like it's not until your heart is broken, and that starts in repentance, because you can't change your heart, right? All you can do is say, God, my heart is cold and it's not right, and you need to change my heart. Because it's not until our hearts break that we are going to do what's necessary to develop those relationships with people who are in places and have views that I'm not familiar with, comfortable with, and you got to push through that. But God can use anyone. I'd love to share this one story. Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, just earlier this month, our team in Houston, we've got a really nicely developing team in Houston, and most of our team members tend to be young, under 35, but not exclusively. And there's this one guy on our team, his name's Roger. He's like, a middle-aged, white suburban dad guy, right?
Yeah.
And not necessarily the most cool, hip, relevant guy, but his heart is broken. And he's like, I want to do something about this. And he's been through our training, and he went out with our team that night to a club that was having a big Cinco de Mayo party late at night, like after midnight. And they were just there to build connections and relationships. And they end up connecting with a group of young people. And there's this one young woman, 20 years old or so, and she was really engaging, and she was starting to connect. And she asked this very kind of random and unique question, which was like, what are you good at? And she was asking all these guys that are on our team. And then she came to the middle-aged white guy and asked him, what are you good at? And he kind of looked at her and he's like, well, I think I'm pretty good at being a dad. I love spending time with my kids. And that rocked her. Wow. She just started to cry, stood up and gave him a hug, and it just rocked her. And then one of our female team members stepped in, shared the gospel, prayed with her, and she was rocked late at night at a bar at a Cinco de Mayo party. Like being used by a uncool middle-aged guy from the suburbs. Like that's what I guess my encouragement there. God can use anyone to reach these people, and we just need our hearts broken enough to go do it.
Yeah. So perhaps our most important prayer, right, is God, just break my heart for what you want it to be broken for. Break my heart for what your heart is broken for. God, put that passion in me that will drive me, will direct me where to go and get trained, to get involved. I love the fact that y'all are partnering with churches that already exist to try to resource them and train them and mobilize them into the kind of mission that most churches that I know of already want to do anyway. They just need some assistance. They need some training. They need some vision about where and how to go and find those things. And the great thing is, they don't even have to leave town.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's awesome.
And in some cases, right, it's because, the church could have done better. Maybe the church lost its vision and passion. Sometimes it's just because the world came to a place like Houston, right? The world has, one thing I say about my two millennial children, they look at the world as a much smaller place. They look at it more like a neighborhood, and they look at technology and they look at airplanes like they're taxis. And like, they don't ask questions like, well, I wonder if I could ever go there. They're like, well, when will I go there? Because I plan to go everywhere, right?
And it's because they're part of the global youth culture, which is which is the heart of who we're called to reach, is this globally connected generation that's created problems in terms of ideology and lifestyle and all that, but it's created incredible opportunities as well. So.
Yeah, that's a great word for us to end on. Aaron, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for what you're doing for the global youth culture. Thank you for what you're doing in places like Ukraine, and thank you for bringing some of your focus into the United States, into Texas, into places like Houston and soon to be Dallas. We're excited to do that. If people want to know more about you, they can find you at Steiger International. You do a simple Google search. We'll put it in the show notes as well. And we hope today has been helpful for the kingdom and helpful for people to get connected, get mobilized, get trained, and be involved in what God's doing. We want to see him bring a revival in the church around the world. We want to see him bring an awakening in this generation in our lifetime. And that's what we'd long to see. So thank you for being a part of the conversation.
It was awesome. I've had fun.